In 68 AD, the most powerful man on earth ran through the dark with no shoes on, no guards, no servants, no Senate escort, just a 30-year-old man stumbling through back roads outside Rome, hiding his face, listening for horses. 12 hours earlier, he had been emperor. Now, the Senate had voted him a specific death. To be stripped naked, locked in a wooden fork, and beaten with rods until he stopped breathing. He couldn't do it. He couldn't face it. So he pressed a blade to his own throat. And his hands shook so badly that a secretary had to help him finish. His last words, "What an artist dies in me." Not what a ruler, not what an emperor, an artist. That sentence explains everything about how Rome lost a dynasty that had ruled for 100 years. But it doesn't start with the fire. It starts with money. Most channels won't cover what comes next. This one will subscribe. In October of 54 AD, Emperor Claudius ate a plate of mushrooms at dinner. By morning he was dead. The palace moved fast. Before sunrise, the Taurian Guard, the only military force inside Rome, marched a 16-year-old boy to their barracks and declared him emperor. His name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. He had not fought a single battle. He had not governed a single province. He had never commanded troops. He was emperor because his mother, Agrena the Younger, had spent a decade engineering it. She had married Claudius. She had convinced him to adopt Nero over his own biological son, Britannicus. And when the timing was right, she served the mushrooms. At least that was what Rome whispered. No trial, no evidence presented, just the timing and the result. Nero took the throne. Agrena stood behind it. And for the first 5 years, something unexpected happened. Rome functioned. Nero's tutor, the Stoic philosopher Seneca, and the Taurian prefect Burrus essentially ran the government. Taxes were reviewed. Provincial governors were held to account. The Senate was consulted on legislation, something that had become a formality under Claudius. The treasury was healthy. The borders were stable. Nero gave public speeches written by Seneca that emphasized justice and restraint. But behind the rhetoric, there was a problem the public couldn't see. Nero did not care about governing. He had been raised on Greek poetry, music, theater, and competition. He practiced the lyre for hours. He studied vocal technique. He composed verses and performed them for small audiences of courtiers. None of this was illegal. None of it was unusual for a wealthy Roman. But Nero wasn't wealthy. He was emperor. And the distinction mattered because the Roman treasury was not the emperor's personal fortune. It was the financial engine of an empire that stretched from Britain to Syria, that paid 300,000 soldiers, that maintained roads and aqueducts and grain shipments across the Mediterranean. And Nero was starting to treat it like a personal account. The spending was still small: banquets, performers, gifts for favorites, but the trajectory was visible to anyone watching. Seneca was watching. Burrus was watching. And so was Agrena. Agrena had put Nero on the throne to control him. When she realized she couldn't, she made a threat. She began publicly supporting Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, the boy Nero had displaced. Britannicus was 14. He had a legitimate claim, and Agrena was signaling to the Senate and the Guard that she had the ability to replace one emperor with another. In February of 55 AD, at a dinner banquet, Britannicus took a drink, convulsed, and collapsed. He was dead within minutes. Nero told the room it was an epileptic seizure. The body was cremated that same night before dawn in the rain. No physician examined the body publicly. No inquiry was held. The ashes were buried without ceremony. Britannicus was 14 years old. The Senate said nothing. The Guard said nothing. Agrena said nothing. At least not publicly. But the calculus shifted. Nero had demonstrated something that even Agrena hadn't fully anticipated. He was willing to eliminate threats at the dinner table in front of witnesses and dare anyone to object. Agrena's position changed overnight. She was no longer the power behind the throne. She was a liability. Someone who knew too much, who had her own alliances, and who had just seen what her son would do to a blood relative. For the next 4 years, Nero gradually stripped her of influence. Her guard detail was removed. She was relocated from the imperial palace. Her allies in court were reassigned. But Nero didn't stop there. In 59 AD, Agrena was invited to a festival at Baiae on the coast near Naples. Nero was affectionate. He embraced her publicly. He gave her a specially designed boat for the journey home. The boat was engineered to collapse at sea. It did. But Agrena survived. She swam to shore. When Nero received word that his mother was alive, he sent soldiers. They found her in her villa. According to the historian Tacitus, when she saw the swords, she pointed to her abdomen and said, "Strike here." This is where Nero came from. They killed her. Nero told the Senate she had been plotting against him and had taken her own life when the plot was discovered. No one believed it, but no one acted. And that was the pattern that would define the next 9 years. Nero removed a constraint. Rome absorbed the shock, and the absence of consequences encouraged the next removal. His first wife, Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, was exiled on false adultery charges, then executed. Her head was sent to Nero's new wife, Poppaea, as confirmation. Burrus died in 62 AD, possibly poisoned, though the sources aren't certain. He was replaced by Tigellinus, a man whose loyalty to Nero was absolute and whose interest in governance was non-existent. Seneca, seeing the direction, asked permission to retire. Nero granted it but kept his estates under surveillance. By 63 AD, every person who had restrained Nero's spending, challenged his judgment, or represented an alternative center of power was either dead, exiled, or silenced. The treasury was now entirely in Nero's hands. And then in July of 64 AD, Rome caught fire. The fire started near the Circus Maximus in the shops and stalls packed between the stadium and the Palatine Hill. It burned for 6 days. Then it reignited and burned for 3 more. When it was over, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been damaged. 3 were completely destroyed. Hundreds of temples, thousands of homes, entire neighborhoods of the densest city in the ancient world gone. The scale was staggering. And the question that consumed Rome was immediate. Who started it? The historian Tacitus, writing roughly 50 years later, records 3 theories that circulated at the time. The first, it was an accident. Rome was a city of timber-framed buildings, narrow streets, open-flame cooking, and summer heat. Fires were common. A fire of this scale was unusual but not impossible. The second, Nero ordered it. He wanted to clear land for a massive building project and used the fire as cover. This was the version that stuck in popular memory. The third, Nero didn't order it, but he did nothing to stop it and may have interfered with firefighting efforts because the destruction served his plans. The sources disagree. Tacitus himself doesn't commit to a single version. But here's what matters more than who started the fire. What happened in the weeks after it? Nero did in fact open his palaces and gardens to refugees. He organized grain distribution. He reduced the price of corn. He implemented new building codes, wider streets, fire-resistant materials, mandatory courtyards. These were real measures. They addressed real problems, and they were completely overshadowed by what came next. First, the blame. Nero selected a target, the Christians. At the time, Christians were a small marginal sect in Rome, distinct from the Jewish community, but poorly understood by the general population. They were outsiders. They had no political patrons. They were easy to isolate. Nero arrested members of the community. Trials were held, though the standards of evidence were unclear. Convictions followed quickly. Then came the punishments. According to Tacitus, some were wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. Others were coated in pitch and set on fire as human torches to light Nero's gardens at night. The public spectacle was meant to redirect anger away from Nero and toward a visible enemy. It worked partially. The rumors about Nero's involvement in the fire continued, but the immediate political crisis was contained. The executions achieved their short-term objective. But the fire source created something Nero hadn't planned for, an opportunity. The heart of Rome was now empty, and Nero intended to fill it. What Nero built on the ruins of the fire was not a reconstruction project. It was the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. The scale needs to be understood in physical terms. The complex covered between 100 and 300 acres of central Rome depending on which ancient source you follow. For comparison, the Roman Forum, the political, religious, and commercial center of the entire empire, occupied roughly 5 acres. Nero's private residence occupied more space than the public heart of Roman civilization. The main building had over 300 rooms. None of them appear to have been bedrooms. The structure was designed for entertaining, display, and spectacle. The walls were covered in gold leaf. Ceilings were fitted with panels of ivory that could slide open to shower guests with flowers and perfume. The main dining room featured a rotating mechanism. The ceiling turned continuously, mimicking the movement of the heavens. An artificial lake was constructed in the valley where the Colosseum would later stand. Vineyards and pastures were laid out around it, creating the illusion of countryside inside the city. At the entrance stood a bronze statue of Nero, over 100 foot tall, modeled on the Colossus of Rhodes. When the palace was completed, Nero reportedly said, "At last, I can begin to live like a human being." That sentence landed in Rome like a detonation because the city was still rebuilding. Thousands were still homeless. Entire districts were still rubble. And the emperor had just taken the most valuable land in the center of the capital. Land that had held temples, public buildings, and private homes, and turned it into a personal estate. He hadn't rebuilt Rome. He had replaced it with himself. But buildings, no matter how offensive, don't overthrow emperors. What came next did. The Doria was catastrophically expensive. The treasury was already strained from the fire relief efforts, from Nero's years of escalating spending, and from the ongoing military costs of maintaining an empire. And Nero needed more money. So, he did 2 things. The first was visible. He began confiscating the estates of wealthy senators and equestrians. After the Ponian conspiracy of 65 AD, a real but poorly organized plot to assassinate Nero, he used the investigation as pretext for mass seizures. Over a dozen senators were executed or forced to commit suicide. Their property was absorbed into the imperial treasury. Seneca was among them. His former tutor, the man who had written his speeches, shaped his early reign, and tried to moderate his excesses, was ordered to open his own veins. Seneca's wife tried to die with him. Nero's soldiers stopped her. The message to the Roman elite was received clearly. Wealth was no longer safe. Property was no longer secure. Proximity to the emperor was no longer protection. It was exposure. But the second thing Nero did was invisible, and it was far more dangerous. The Roman denarius was the foundation of the imperial economy. It paid the legions. It settled debts. It moved through trade routes from Britain to India. Provincial taxes were assessed in denarii. Military bonuses were calculated in denarii. Grain prices were denominated in denarii. For over 200 years, from the time of Augustus through the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius, the denarius maintained a silver content of roughly 95 to 98%. This consistency wasn't accidental. Augustus had understood that Rome's ability to project power depended on soldiers trusting that their pay would hold its value. A legion in Syria and a legion in Germany had to believe the same coin was worth the same amount. Nero changed this. In approximately 64 AD, the same year as the fire, Nero reduced the silver content of the denarius from roughly 97.5 to 93.5%. He also reduced the weight. The coins looked almost identical to the old ones. The imagery was the same. The lettering was the same. Only someone weighing or assaying the metal would notice the difference. That was the point. By reducing the silver content, Nero could produce more coins from the same amount of silver. More coins meant more spending capacity without raising taxes, without conquering new territory, without increasing trade revenue. It was in mechanical terms the same principle behind printing money, and it worked immediately. The treasury had more liquidity. Building projects continued. The Domus Aurea moved toward completion. But the denarius didn't exist in isolation. It existed inside a network of trust. Merchants who accepted denarii in Rome also traded with merchants in Egypt, Greece, and the Parthian Empire. Those foreign merchants evaluated coins by weight and silver content, not by the face stamped on them. When the reduced denarii entered circulation, the exchange rate shifted. Roman coins were worth less in foreign markets. Imported goods became more expensive. The cost of luxury materials, the marble, the gold leaf, the ivory that Nero's building projects demanded went up. Inside the empire, the effects were slower but compounded over time. Prices rose. The purchasing power of savings declined. Anyone holding denarii, from soldiers to merchants to ordinary citizens, found that their money bought less each year. But the group that mattered most was the legions. Roman soldiers served for 20 to 25 years. Their pay was fixed by imperial decree. They received a set number of denarii per year with bonuses for victories and a lump sum retirement payment. When the silver content dropped, their pay didn't change in nominal terms. They still received the same number of coins, but each coin contained less silver, which meant each coin purchased less grain, less wine, less equipment. Their wages had been cut. They just hadn't been told. And Roman soldiers were not unsophisticated about money. Many had been recruited from families with commercial backgrounds. They weighed coins. They noticed when the metal felt lighter, when the edges were slightly different, when prices at the camp market crept upward for no visible reason. The denarius debasement didn't cause an immediate mutiny. It didn't need to. What it did was erode the baseline assumption that the emperor's coin was trustworthy and by extension that the emperor himself was trustworthy. This erosion was slow. It was invisible on any given day, but it accumulated, and when the crisis came, it would determine which way the legions turned. By 67 AD, the Roman Empire was running on momentum. The treasury was depleted. The senatorial class had been hollowed out by executions and confiscations. Provincial governors were under pressure to increase tax revenue from populations that were already strained. And Nero was in Greece. He had left Rome to compete in the Olympic Games and tour the Greek festival circuit. He entered every competition: chariot racing, singing, acting, poetry. He won everyone. He won because no judge was willing to score against the emperor. This wasn't unusual for Nero. He had performed publicly in Rome for years, but the Greek tour lasted over a year. During that time, the emperor was functionally absent from governance. He did, however, make one major policy announcement while in Greece. He declared the province of Achaia, the Roman designation for Greece, free from taxation. The Greek cities celebrated. The Roman treasury absorbed another blow, and the provinces that were being taxed more heavily to compensate watched as Nero gave away revenue for applause. In March of 68 AD, the governor of Galliensis, modern-day central France, launched a revolt. His name was Gaius Julius Vindex. He was of Gic aristocratic descent, a Roman senator, and he governed a province that had been squeezed for increased taxation for years. Vindex didn't claim the throne for himself. He called on the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, Servius Orpicius Galba, to replace Nero. Galba was 70 years old, from an old patrician family, and had a reputation for conservative financial management. He was the opposite of Nero in almost every measurable way. Galba initially hesitated, then he accepted. The revolt itself was disorganized. The legions of Upper Germany, still loyal to Nero at this point, defeated Vindex's forces at the Battle of Vancio in May of 68. Vindex killed himself, but the revolt had done something that couldn't be undone. It had demonstrated that a provincial governor could openly reject the emperor and attract support. And the legions of Upper Germany, the ones who had just crushed the rebellion, weren't celebrating. They had won, but they hadn't been rewarded. Their pay was still denominated in debased denarii. Their general hadn't received recognition from Nero, and they could see that the Eastern legions, the Taurian Guard, and the provincial governors were all recalculating their positions. In June of 68 AD, the Taurian Guard, the force that had made Nero emperor 14 years earlier, received an offer from Galba's agents. The offer was money. Specifically, it was a donative, a one-time bonus payment that Roman emperors traditionally gave the Guard at accession. Galla promised each guardsman a substantial sum. The Guard accepted. On June 9, 68 AD, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy, hostis publicus, and recognized Galba as emperor. Nero learned the Senate had turned when he woke in the middle of the night at his palace and found his guards missing. Gone. Not killed, not reassigned, simply gone. He sent messengers to the barracks. No response he sent for his close companions. Their houses were empty. He went to the barracks himself. The gates were closed. Nero returned to the palace. He reportedly called for a gladiator or soldier, anyone willing to kill him so he wouldn't have to face what the Senate had planned. No one volunteered. A small group of freed men, former slaves who had been part of his household, offered to hide him. One of them, Phaon, had a villa 4 miles outside the city. They left the palace on horseback. Nero wore a disguise, a cloak with the hood raised, a cloth across his face. He rode in silence except once. When they passed a group of Taurian soldiers on the road, one of them reportedly said, "Those men are chasing Nero." Another said, "What news of Nero in the city?" Nero said nothing. They passed. At Phaon's villa, they entered through a hole dug in the rear wall to avoid being seen. Inside, Nero waited. He could hear riders in the distance. The Senate had dispatched soldiers to find him. The declared sentence was execution in the ancient manner. The fork, the rods, the public death. Nero held a dagger. He pressed it against his throat. Pulled it away. Pressed it again. Pulled it away. He asked one of the freedmen to show him how it was done. The man demonstrated the angle. Still Nero hesitated. Then hoofbeats close. One of his freed men, or according to some accounts his secretary, Apophroditos, guided the blade. Nero's throat was cut when the soldiers arrived minutes later. One of them tried to staunch the bleeding with a cloth. He was too late. Nero's last words, according to Suetonius, "What an artist dies in me." He was 30 years old. He had been emperor for 13 years and 8 months. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the bloodline that stretched back through Claudius, Caligula, Tiberius, and Augustus himself. With his death, that line ended. The Great Fire destroyed 10 of 14 districts of the city of Rome. Rome rebuilt every one of them. The Doisa occupied up to 300 acres of central Rome. Nero's successors demolished it and built public monuments in its place, including the Colosseum, which sits where Nero's private lake once was. The denarius debasement was never reversed. Nero's successors didn't restore the silver content. They reduced it further. Within 150 years, the denarius would contain less than 50% silver. Within 250 years, it would be bronze with a thin silver wash. The pattern Nero established, spending beyond revenue to basing the currency to cover the gap, losing the confidence of the military, repeated itself across the next 3 centuries. The fire burned for 9 days. The debasement burned for generations. Buildings can be rebuilt. Currency once debased follows a direction that no emperor in Roman history ever successfully reversed. That's what Nero did that was worse than the fire. He demonstrated that an emperor could devalue the money and the system wouldn't immediately collapse, so every emperor after him did the same thing until it